Okay, here we've got the constitutional amendments to the Louisiana State Constitution. Here's one that would allow the state to require um, minimum requirements for registrars of voters in each parish. The reason why this is necessary, or why the people who would support this measure think it's necessary, is because some registrars lack qualifications for the job. Right now, the qualifications are extremely low. There is a training which some people who oppose this measure deem to be sufficient. I think that in general, the duty of the registrar of voters is important enough to require them to have some qualifications in order to get the job. The qualifications, basically what's going to happen is if the constitutional amendment passes, then a couple of laws will go into effect. One of them is these qualifications that requires a bachelor degree from an accredited college and 2 years of professional experience, which is deemed basically as office work, or an associate's degree and at least 4 years of full-time professional work experience, or 7 years of professional work experience anywhere, or 5 years of full-time employment in Louisiana's registrar's office. The people who say that we shouldn't enable this say that either the training is sufficient, say that rural parishes won't be able to find qualified candidates. That's malarkey. I've spent some time in rural parishes, and there are people there who A, have college degrees, and B, want jobs. And the other thing is they're worried about people who, like, say, the assistant registrars perhaps being the most qualified person, not being able to ascend to the job of registrar because they don't meet the requirements. If you don't have 5 years of experience uh, and you are unwilling to, say, get an associate's degree, then you probably don't deserve the job. Um, you know, it's not that hard to get an associate's degree or a college degree. Um, and if you really do intend to be the registrar of voters, then yeah, you should become qualified for it. So I'm voting yes on that. So I should have mentioned the other law that comes into effect when this comes into effect basically says that the governor cannot certify a registrar of voters unless the parish can prove that they did publicly publish the vacancy and did some reasonable due diligence about advertising the job to outside people. This is specifically to fight nepotism, which has been a problem amongst registrars of voters. So yeah, I'm voting yes on this. Good Lord. I'm voting yes on this because I both support some actual qualifications for being registrar of voters, and I support uh, advertising the job to the public because I'm opposed to nepotism. Oh, and another thing, these small jobs, they're really important. Like the county level jobs, when I've worked in courthouses and things, these people have significant sway, even though they're constrained by the law as to what they can and cannot do. Having a competent registrar of voters is hugely important. Hugely important. We hear about voter fraud and voter disenfranchisement and all sorts of other horrible things. Having competent registrars of voters, competent and good natured and qualified registrars of voters, would prevent a lot of that. Let me rephrase that. There isn't a lot of that, but would decrease the likelihood of that occurring. It's important to have a good registrar. Okay, the next constitutional amendment, it's number 2, establish tuition without legislative approval. Right now, the situation in Louisiana is that the legislature decides what tuition is going to be at the various colleges, and the colleges, well, let me rephrase that, for the state colleges, and the state colleges want the ability to have a board of governors or something oversee that process without needing legislative approval. I'm going to support this one as well. I think it's absurd that we need an act of Congress in order to change tuition. Now, by voting yes, I am admitting that I think and am okay with tuition increasing in public institutions. I don't love that. I would rather it go down, but the budgetary state of Louisiana, we're in such a bad place. Thanks, John Kennedy and Bobby Jindal, but we are in such a bad economic environment right now that I think forcing our institutions of higher learning to go to the legislature for approval unnecessarily hamstrings them in their ability to fund themselves. Also, given the inability of our legislature to budget correctly or appropriately or well or at all or whatever the hell they're doing there in Baton Rouge, um, yeah, I think that the colleges should be able to raise and lower tuition under their board of governors without legislative approval. I've long thought that this was a really terrible thing that Louisiana does. I have heard and read of instances in which the legislature has been somewhat petty and cruel um, with their choice of where to send money, which colleges to promote, which colleges not. Um, and yeah, I think it's just a flat out good choice. Even if there was no budgetary crisis, I think I would still support this. But the budgetary crisis makes this a no brainer for me. I'm absolutely 100% on board with um, colleges and universities having a not needing legislative approval in order to raise or lower tuition. Okay, so this next constitutional amendment number 3, eliminates the deductibility of federal income taxes. So this this is the law that I don't like. I'm going to vote for it ultimately, but I don't like it. There's a couple of things that are really heinous here. Eliminate deductibility of federal income taxes, right? That sounds terrible. And then here you said you support an amendment to eliminate the deductibility of federal income taxes paid in computing state corporate income taxes. But that's not all this law does. This is really poorly worded, even deceptively worded. So, what this constitutional amendment actually does is it takes the top corporate state tax rate from 8% down to 6.5%. It eliminates everything below 6.5%. So, all corporations will be paying 6.5% income tax for state income tax. Currently, if you make like 25 grand or less and you file as a corporation, then you only pay 4%, so on and so forth, up to 200 grand, which is where you're paying 8% on anything above 200 grand. And I think it's just really poorly, it seems deceptively poorly worded. Um, so, but, so what's ultimately happening, my understanding of this constitutional amendment anyway, is that corporations are going to not be able to deduct federal income tax from their state taxes. And as in exchange, corporations, the rate is going to become flat and it's going to be 6.5%, which for most corporations and large corporations is going to bring it down from 8. Now, this, I don't, I mean, there are reasons not to like this law. I don't like the fact that it gets rid of the lower tax rates. I think people who, or corporations who make not much money should not have to pay the higher rate because they can't afford to like pile up losses and therefore have, you know, be able to manipulate their federal tax rate. Basically, they're not gaining much on the plus side of this, being able to eliminate the deductibility of federal income taxes because their federal income taxes aren't. Small businesses don't control how much they pay in federal income taxes like big businesses do. For instance, if you can afford to take losses, you can change the federal income tax picture for some years and then not for others, and then you pay a high income tax in another year and deduct it. But smaller businesses can't afford to do that kind of manipulation, so they're not really going to see much of the benefit here. Um, However, most corporations who make less than 200 grand a year actually file under their owners, the proprietors' personal income tax. That's what I did when um, I was officially an LLC. I generally just file personal income tax because it didn't make sense for me to pay corporate tax and then do personal tax. And I would have been in the 6% tax rate there. So uh, it didn't make sense for me to do that. It wouldn't make sense for most corporations who make less than 200 grand to file individually as opposed to just filing under their proprietor's personal income tax. Um, so that's ultimately why I'm supporting this. The other reason why I am supporting this um, is because it decouples Louisiana's income with the federal tax rate. we don't know what's going to happen with the federal tax rate, and it's unfair for Louisiana to be kind of caught in the go between. So, like if the federal tax rate increases on corporations, which some candidates are wanting to do, um, we'll see if Congress can actually pass anything. But if it does, that would decrease the income for Louisiana, and we're in a time in which we need income stability and predictability. So I'm voting yes here for that reason. Um, I do feel bad that I think some small businesses may get hurt here. Um, but I think the good outweighs the bad. I hate the way this bill is worded here, um, but ultimately I think that it will be a net positive legislation. I don't want to call it good legislation. I feel like this legislation could have been written better than this, but I think it's a net positive, so I'm voting for it. Not enthusiastically, clearly, but you know, still, it gets my support. Okay, so this next one, constitutional amendment number 4, the homestead exemption surviving spouse. So what this does, at the moment, most people have a homestead exemption on their first house up to $75,000 of its value. For veterans, rather the surviving spouses of deceased or disabled veterans, they get up to $150,000 of the value of their home exempted from. They get a homestead exemption for $150,000 for the first home. So this act would expand that to widows and widowers for police and fire who have passed, and instead of it being 100% of the first 150,000, it becomes 100% of the full assessed value of the home. A lot of this seems like a no-brainer. We should just flat pass it because it's the widows of dead police officers or something. Um, I actually am voting against this, and not because I'm an asshole, though I may be an asshole. Um, I'm voting against it because there are some really bad precedents set in this law. Um, Firstly, there's a bad precedent of increasing exemptions to the tax base for more people. There's a clause in this law where the widow or widower will have to um, sign an affidavit that they have not remarried. And I think by piling up exemptions for widows and widowers, provided that they do not remarry, is a really bad precedent to set, particularly with um, in the case of veterans. Um, so generally, war dead people who die in combat are younger people. Veterans are people who have been around longer generally don't die as often as the newer recruits. And so most of the people who die in combat are in their 20s, and their spouses are generally in their 20s. And we should not tie their benefits to remaining single forever. Like, that's absurd. That, like, odd ownership to a dead person seems terrible. So I've made it my decision that I'm voting against every piece of legislation that has any kind of, um, as long as you remain unmarried or do not remarry. I think if a, like if someone loses their spouse in combat and they want to get remarried later, they should be able to do that. Like, why would we want to prevent these people from being happy later? The idea that a 20-something-year-old spouse of a now deceased or disabled veteran, okay, a now deceased veteran, shouldn't be able to remarry is absurd. So I'm voting against it for that reason. Also, it's important that these homesteads, the tax on homesteads, are how we fund a lot of things, particularly education. And it's important that that tax base not be eroded by lots of exemptions. Although I'm not really opposed to the exemption in this case, I'm more opposed to the way the law is written. Um, and I do think we should fund schools differently, but at the moment, I'm voting against this. I understand why people are going to vote for this. This is going to pass overwhelmingly, but I think it's well-meaning and well-intentioned, but despicable in execution. And I voting against this largely because I demand better legislation out of our legislators. Um, I think all of that your spouse cannot remarry stuff should absolutely go away. That should not be a thing in 2016. That should not be a thing in America. That the spouse, the widow of a deceased serviceman should forever remain just a widow, like paused in ember, forever mourning the loss of their husband or wife or whomever. It's just absurd. That shouldn't be a thing. All right, the next constitutional amendment, number 5, Revenue Stabilization Trust Fund. What this does is it creates an additional trust fund that will be funded with money from corporate tax revenue and mineral revenue. Those are both very volatile sources of funding for Louisiana. Part of the reason and manner in which Jindal managed to dig us into that, Jindal and John Kennedy managed to dig us into that god awful hole that we found ourselves in was by making our budget based upon like the mineral income during a mineral boom. And when that mineral boom ended, that income was grossly insufficient. A thing that anyone with any foresight at all would have foreseen. But hey, Jindal and Kennedy and the rest of those folks didn't. So I'm kind of a, yeah. Sorry, I dislike those guys. I dislike the budget crisis that we found ourselves in. Um, I dislike a lot of things about what happened at the end of the Jindal administration. So the Revenue Stabilization Trust Fund, basically what it'll do is it'll take any mineral revenues above, I think, 600 million, six, yes, or so, and put it into a trust fund that can't be used. We also have a unfunded accrued liabilities fund, which is basically bills we owe that we can't pay. Um, a lot of which is retirement for state employees, and most or mineral revenue in excess of, I think it was 630 million will go into that. Um, some years the mineral revenue was $1 billion. Some years it was less than 500 million. So if it ever does wind up higher than 630 or whatever the cutoff is for this particular bill, it goes directly into a couple of trust funds, and I'm 100% for that. Corporate revenue is also fluctuates wildly, um, particularly lately as the economy has been in a state of flux. And I'm all for saying, hey, after you know putting any year in which we have gross windfalls, like it goes well for us, taking that money and putting it in stabilization trust fund or putting it into the accrued, um, unfunded and accrued fund, basically keeping that money aside to pay the bills that we've accrued but haven't funded yet, and to keep the money aside for when it goes back down, because such is the nature of mineral revenue and of corporate tax revenue. Now, the bad side to this is it kind of ties the hands of the legislature. They won't be able to budget all of the money in good years, which they will want to do. And it means that we won't be able to be quite so flexible with our spending in new years should new problems arise. Um, and it creates yet another trust fund, which does decrease transparency of government, of which I'm not a fan. But in this particular case, yeah, I'm very much in favor of making it so that the future governors cannot spend $1 billion, um, cannot budget for $1 billion when they happen to get $1 billion one year, but clearly are not going to continue to get $1 billion. Like we, this was the primary crime with the Jindal administration, budget wise, is taking oil money and rather natural gas money and corporate income tax money and saying, oh, well, clearly we're going to have this level of revenue every year for the next few years. Therefore, we can cut all of these taxes and still pay our bills, our mandatory bills, because we'll have this outrageous mineral wealth. And then when the price of minerals fell, which everybody knew it would do, um, we came up short. And I don't want that to ever happen again. So I'm very much in favor of this act, even if it does decrease transparency somewhat. All right, so this next one, constitutional amendment number 6, use funds to eliminate projected deficits. What this one will do, it's a lot of things, and none of them are adequately described here. So it will allow, okay, currently we, constitutional amendment number 6, use funds to eliminate projected deficits. So this will allow the legislature to access protected funds up to 5% of the funds to withdraw money in total not greater than the projected budget deficits to cover deficits in any given year. They already have the power to do that in the event that the budget decreases by more than 1% than the prior expectation. What this changes is it changes actual budget decreases by more than 1% to a new projection being 1% lower than the previous projection. It's a small change, but what it does is it makes the earlier projections, the budget projections, significantly more important. And that if the next projection shows it being 1% less than the prior, then they can tap into the funds. This one I'm torn on. I don't like anything about it. And I don't like having to be in a position to consider this bill. Again, I'm still very angry at the budget deficits that were left by the prior administration. So this bill also puts certain funds, removes funds from the possibility of being cut. What this will do is it theoretically should allow them to give budget cuts. Well, let me rephrase that. To withdraw funds from protected trusts to prevent budget cuts in, say, healthcare and education, which is the current setup we're in, where healthcare and education really get hammered every time we have a budget deficit because everything else is protected. This gives them a little bit more flexibility to be able to pull the money out, to not have to make those cuts. I don't really like the projection on projection model, like the older projection and the newer projection as opposed to actual revenues. The reason I don't like it is because it gives too much power to the projections. This seems rife for corruption. I don't particularly care for that. I do recognize the need to be able to tap into these funds before like the revenue is officially known. This feels like it's going to be a very begrudging yes for me. I don't like allowing our protected funds to be accessed by the legislature. We protect them for a reason. I don't like making it easier for that. I do like making 5 more funds not accessible. But given the budget crisis that we're in, oh, this is the other thing. I also hate amending the Constitution to deal with the current crisis. I hate that I feel like I have to pass this because our current crisis is so bad that I now have to amend the Constitution to do things that I don't really want to do for the sake of solving this crisis, even at the expense of future crises. And this is the kind of like impossible position that I think that makes me so mad at the general administration and John Kennedy and everybody who worked in part of government back then. Like, if you were part of government during the general administration, I want you gone. Like, I'm sorry, I want to fire absolutely every single one of those people for putting us in this absurd and yet predictable situation where we have to violate our own trust funds, and like, this is going to create more problem later. But we basically have to do this, or we're going to create massive problems right now, and presumably bigger problems right now. Like, we can't cut hospitals and schools any more than they're being cut, but this is going to make future administrations have to do financial gymnastics to be able to, um, you know, to be able to meet future obligations that we should theoretically be funding, and now we're giving us the opportunity to siphon the money away as need comes up. And I also fear that this is going to result in massive, well, not massive, but significant corruption. Not corruption, but when we're incentivizing padding the estimates, and I hate that. Um, I don't want there to be incentives to do this one way or the other. I want the most honest possible um, scenario. And so here I am about to vote for a constitutional amendment that I don't like because we're in a bad spot right now. But I think if we do wind up having to cut hospitals or schools further, we're going to royally screw our future worse than this amendment is going to screw our future. Um, yeah, and I think this is an unfortunate hold your nose and close your eyes, um, because we have to. Uh, that kind of feels like the theme of this election altogether. Hold your nose and close your eyes and vote for the person that you don't like because the other option is just so much worse. Um, you know, I I'm really really deeply unhappy with the way that Louisiana's budget has been taken care of in the prior administration. Um, that's why I'm so willing to just openly trash John Kennedy. Um, you don't get to be the treasurer during the general administration and expect me to have any interest in promoting you. Like it, yeah. I I've said that enough times now. This next one. It's the city of Shreveport. It's a 0.25% sales and use tax, um, to fund the police and fire department. I'm in favor of this. These 0.25% taxes come up all the time because they are always short term. And yeah, this is going to make it a perpetuity starting January of 2018. I'm all for it, man. Like, I'm tired of having to vote on these 0.25% every couple of years. I feel like the Shreveport police and fire departments should have some budget stability and be able to know how much money they're going to make. I mean, they don't know that because it's a sales and use tax, but they'll at least know if the sales or use tax is going to be there. Um, and yeah, I just flat out support this. I think I would support this if it was a 1% sales and use tax. Like, I think our police departments and our fire departments, I think our police officers in particular need to be paid like they have college degrees, and then we need to require all new ones to have college degrees. Like, being a police officer should be a hard job to get. You should need actual, like, serious credentials and a college degree, or some sort of police training that is the equivalent of a college degree and actually takes many, like, several years to get. Not like, oh, I went to the academy and therefore it's like a college degree. It's just, that's a false equivalency. It needs to be hard. You need to study. But in order to have that, we need to be able to pay them like people with college degrees. And right now, the amount of pay that we get for the police department is really unfortunate. And the kind of recruits we get probably reflects the amount of pay we're willing to pay them. So yeah, I'm willing to pay for better police. That said, I hope I actually get better police for being willing to pay for better police. No guarantee that happens. Yeah, so far as I can tell, that's everything on my ballot. I'm sorry I don't have a good answer for the juvenile justices. So yeah, there you go. I hope this is helpful. I probably should have gotten this out weeks ago, but I was waiting. like full.